Hi everyone, it's Anton Sevilla-Liu, and I'm here to talk about standards in interdisciplinary research. And this presentation comes from my own experience of teachers and students who are having difficulty with interdisciplinary communication, evaluating, discussing research of people whose fields are completely different from what one has been exposed to. So what I try to do here is I try to help people differentiate between quantitative and qualitative research and why they're so different, help people see where different methodologies are coming from and how they differ in how they view reality and research, and also concrete tips to help you better communicate, more respectfully communicate with those with different approaches. So interdisciplinarity it's hard. I mean, a lot of times it comes off as just like a tagline, but it's actually something very difficult to do. So we're in a department where people, teachers, students have very different fields, and these fields, it's not just about studying different things, like one person studying society, the other person studying international community and so on. It's not just content, but they different fields can have a very different approach to truth about human beings, about reality. So different approaches have different views on the nature of reality itself. Is reality something really out there, or is it something we've constructed in the way that we make sense of it? People differ in how we think we know reality. So, is our knowledge something that's empirical, grounded in facts, or something interpretative, always adding on to the facts? And then that means that their view of science and the results of science will also differ. So, do they see it as, these are scientific objective facts, or do they see this as one perspective relative to other perspectives? So the problem is, there's no one answer to which one is correct, because depending on the fields, you can have very different answers, and that's the challenge of being in an interdisciplinary program. So, uh, as a teacher or a student evaluating, being evaluated, discussing with people from different fields, do you find yourself struggling with this kind of interdisciplinary communication? And I'm asking this because, in my experience, I've struggled with it. I've seen students struggle with it. I've seen teachers struggling with it, especially during degree project presentation time. And so, some people, I've heard people ask, what am I supposed to ask these students? I've never done research like this before. Or like some students complain, like, why are people asking me these questions? This have nothing to do with the way I do research. Or some people actually get quite emotional about it, and they look at us or listen to a presentation and they're like, wow, I don't think this qualifies as research. Is this even research? So that's the ugly truth of interdisciplinarity. It's challenging, it's hard, and I think we all need time to be mm, honest with the difficulty of the process. So, um, of course, I can't pretend to be completely free from the limitations of my discipline, but educational psychology is a multidisciplinary field, and we have wrestled with these problems before, and there are textbooks about this. So I thought I'd give some suggestions from my field, and the most simple way to start has to do with the gap between quantitative and qualitative research, right? So, depending on the field, depending on the discipline, they have different ratios of quantitative to qualitative research. So, I put this is a very rough estimate, but I put a continuum, a spectrum there. So, obviously, natural science will be much more quantitative, and then when you get to literature, it's somewhat the opposite. You have almost, well, you have some now, but you have almost no quantitative research. So education, psychology are somewhat in the middle, and so we do have to struggle with the communication between both sides. And so, quantitative and qualitative, this gives us a very simple example of how you have completely different paradigms. So with quantitative research, which is of course the mainstream of academic research, what they're trying to do is examine observable behavior with many participants, try to get a big sample size. But data is numeric, and so there's less information for each individual participant, and so you try to maintain objective distance from the data, and then you try to predict and explain. and make generalizations about the whole population in order to, oftentimes, not always, but in order to confirm a theory. This is called the hypothetical deductive approach. Now, of course, there are differences within quantitative methods too, but in general, this is what it's trying to do. And when most of you think about scientific method, when most of you think about science, this is probably the picture that you get. Now, qualitative research is something that, well, right now it's a minority compared to quantitative research, but it's a growing field. And what they're trying to do is simply very different. So it's not just about using words and having smaller sample sizes, but fundamentally what it tries to do is different. So what they're trying to do is examine not observable behavior, but subjective meaning. So they're looking at smaller sample sizes, but because the data is text and multisensory, there's much more information per participant. And in order to understand this, the only way is to personally engage the data. You can't just look at it from a distance, or all you see is a surface. You won't get the meaning. And so you need to describe and interpret. And thus, what you're doing is not making generalizations, but exploring particularity and variation in experience. And so what you're trying to do here is generate new ways of seeing things, so inductive and abductive reasoning. So what you see here is they're just trying to do completely different things. And a lot of our misunderstanding comes from trying to impose the standards of one to the other. Quantitative people don't do what qualitative people do, and vice versa. And so that can be challenging if you're not exposed to both. So when we talk about, what is good research, there are a lot of ways to answer this question. I came up with a list of 14 criteria. Uh, I don't think this is a perfect list, but this is a general list that many people might agree with. Reliable data and statistical analysis, representativeness of sample, clear theoretical background and hypothesis, validity, transferability and generalizability, non-bias, reliable interpretation, theoretical analysis, documentation, grounding in examples, checking opposing views, context sensitivity, reflexivity, internal coherence, resonance. It sounds like a nice list of things that would be good to have in your research. But if you look at this list, I think you start to see that, hey, wait a second, does everybody agree with all of these? And so, what the Willig points out in her explanation of qualitative psychology is that actually, depending on your approach, so if you're doing quantitative research, a lot of times you have what they call a realist approach. You're looking for the reality objectively out there. When you have a realist approach, it's the first four that are very, very important. But when you're a qualitative researcher, so you don't look at reality out there, but you're looking at interpretations of reality, critical realist, constructionist, it's from 5 to 14 that become important depending on the tradition that you're coming from. So again, what is good research? If you look at the wrong part, you might be misjudging what the other people are trying to do. And this gets even more confusing because depending on the methodology that you use, so it's not, qualitative, quantitative, it's not a simple binary, but depending on the type of methodology that you're using, you might be emphasizing a different part. For instance, hermeneutics doesn't really look at generalizability and non-bias. But it does look at reflexivity and coherence, so the stress is different. And so this is something that gets very difficult to get very clear. But what I do want to point out here, you don't have to memorize all of these, but just to know that different methods will emphasize different things. So that was a long list, so I thought I'd explain them a little bit more. And this can function as a quick guide for what to ask students or researchers, depending on what their field is. Questions you can ask them, but also these are questions that you can ask yourself as you prepare to make your presentation. If you're a student, I guess also if you're a teacher, yeah. So let's start with quantitative research, right? So as I said, quantitative researchers are often realists. They're looking for a reality out there that they're trying to objectively describe. So the first criteria is reliable data and statistical analysis. Are your measurements stable? Is the data analyzed using appropriate statistical measures? Do these support the conclusions? Basically, is your statistics good, right? And then representativeness of sample, given the population you're trying to look at, are you looking at the right people to represent that sample? Is your sample size big enough? Um, I don't know what they push now in undergraduate, but in professional research, when we do quantitative, we're hitting the hundreds, 300 people. That's not uncommon. Design of questionnaires and scales. Are the questionnaire and scales valid and appropriate to the hypothesis? Are you using the right scale? If you're translating your scale, is it translated properly, and so on. And then clear hypothesis and variables. So usually you're testing your hypothesis, and so are the hypothesis and variables measured clear? If you're testing the theory, is the theory clear? And then also when you're looking at relationships between variables, causal relationships, correlational relationships, do you do this well? This also connects to your statistics. So this is something I think everyone is familiar with, but very important to note, this is quantitative research. So this makes a lot of sense because most of us were trained in some form of quantitative research, but it's important to know that these are not universal. So when it comes to qualitative research, almost always this will not apply. So when it comes to qualitative research, again, as I said, it depends on the type of qualitative research. So there are qualitative realists like grounded theory. They are trying to look at reality as it is. Um, that's one type of grounded theory, the old kind, but they're using not numbers but words, and so they do look at transferability and generalizability. Can your conclusions apply beyond the cases you looked at? If no, were you clear about it? Non-biased and reliable interpretation, you have to make sure you test your interpretation against the interpretation of others. They do things like cross-coding. Theoretical analysis, did you go beyond just describing the surface of the data to actually make the connections, the explanatory connections? Now, those are for people like grounded theory, but when you get to narrative and phenomenological research, there is no longer a presumption of realism. So they don't presume that there's a reality out there that you can access directly, but you're always interpreting reality, you're always making sense of reality. So here, you can't really get a perfectly unbiased, objective view of reality. So what do you do to maintain rigor? Number one, documentation. Did you explain how you got uh, from your data to your conclusions in a way that others can understand and check? Number two, grounding in examples. Do you present examples that show where your interpretations come from in a way that makes sense? Number three, checking opposing views. So usually you don't code alone, but you also have somebody else look at your codes and see if your codes make sense to them, checking different interpretations, trying different interpretations even by yourself. Context sensitivity. Um, Again, the data is not just, immediately this is how things are. It doesn't clearly state how to make sense of it, so you interpret based on the context. Are you clear about the kind of context that influences the way you interpret? And then this is really a key, the last one is really a key for qualitative research: reflexivity. Because you're using your sensitivity as a subjective being to make sense of the reality, then you have to know in what ways does your background, your language, your academic approach influence the way you interpret the data? If you don't know how you might bias your reading of the data, then you lack reflexivity. So that's for narrative and phenomenological research. That's very common. Some types of ethnography will also be that way. And then the most extreme form of qualitative research is what they call radical constructionism. Here, you're not even thinking about whether there is a reality or not. It is really the world of interpretations that are a lot of times constructed. um, Whether or not there's a reality behind them, they don't even care about that anymore. So you have this position in discourse analysis. Postmodern forms of analysis often use this kind of an epistemology, they call it, right? And here, you're not looking at all at objectivity, but you're looking at internal coherence. Does your position make sense? Does it give an enlightening big picture? And also resonance. Do your readers feel they understand the subject matter better after reading your paper? So a lot of it really has to do with how your paper comes together and the kind of effect that it has, rather than really pointing out if it's clearly rooted in the data. Now, if you're coming from a different field, if you notice some of these, you're just not comfortable with them because that's not how you were trained. But in a sense, as we, it's like interdisciplinary communication is kind of like intercultural communication. These are the places that we tend to be biased against because we have different beliefs, and this is where we have to be careful to be respectful. So, in summary, research fields have different approaches to truth. This is especially stark between quantitative and qualitative approaches to research, which exist in different ratios in different fields. So, when you're dialoguing with people doing different research from your own, let's try to be respectful of our differences. It's like intercultural communication, really. So the list of 14 standards for research and knowing which apply to the research methodology of the other person might help us ask more relevant and respectful questions. And so again, none of these are final. These are just a hint. These are just suggestions as we try to dialogue with each other in more productive ways, despite the fact that we have very different approaches to how we see research. Thank you very much.